Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Detroit Public Library's virtual author series. Tonight, we're here with Caseen Gaines, and he will be speaking to my colleague, Romy Minor. We're gonna start with Romy's introduction. Romy is a native Detroiter, born and raised with degrees from Wayne State University. He also has his archival certificate from Wayne. He is currently a librarian assistant manager in Popular Library and Music, Art, and Literature Department, as well as the curator for the E. Azalea Hackley Collection of the African Americans in Performing Arts at the Detroit Public Library. He also has his own book, Detroit Thanksgiving Parade. He's the co-author of that, and that was published in 2003. Our guest tonight is Caseen Gaines. He is an author, director, educator, and popular culture historian. His work has received praise from media outlets around the world, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, The Hollywood Reporter, and Esquire. His latest book, which we'll be discussing tonight, is Footnotes, the Black artist who rewrote the rules of the Great White Way. It was published in May of 2021 by Source Books. He has been published at Vanity Fair and the New York Magazine and has written original features for Rolling Stone, the AV Club, and The Decider. He has also worked as a consultant and ghostwriter on several narrative nonfiction projects. He holds a master's degree from Rutgers University in American Studies, where he focused on racial representation in popular culture. And in addition to writing, is a co-artistic director of a nonprofit theater company he co-founded in 2005 with a high school English teacher in New Jersey, where he has taught for 14 years. So let's welcome these two gentlemen tonight for a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
No, thanks so much, Christine. Okay, Caseen, great book, Footnotes. Really enjoyed it. First question for you. The book starts off with Love Will Find a Way, that production number. And being a historian, and this is how I'm going to focus this, in the Azalea Hackley collection, we actually have that sheet music, Love Will Find a Way, and that by Noble Sissel and U.B. Blake, and sung by Lottie G. Why did you start the book out with that particular performance?
Well, there are lots of reasons, and thank you again for having me today, and thank you everyone who's here joining us. Love Will Find a Way is really such a seminal moment in this story about Shuffle Along, this first all-Black Broadway show to succeed from 1921. And you really have to put yourself in that time period and know that there had been about 10 years where there were no all-Black productions, major productions in Manhattan at all. Williams and Walker had a great run of shows before, but there had been this drought. And so when this show Shuffle Along came about, they did a little bit of a tour. Their first performance was in Trenton, New Jersey. They did some in Philadelphia, some throughout Pennsylvania. And when they came back to New York, there were death threats sent to the theater about this particular moment in the show where a Black man was going to express love and affection for a woman. And the thing that might be surprising to the people that are here joining us is it was a Black woman as well. It wasn't even a white woman. The thing that was so controversial was that these two Black people could actually possess and share the feeling of love. And it wasn't that love wasn't or it wasn't that romance wasn't expressed on stage before between two Black people, but it was either there was a Jezebel character or a Sapphire, this sort of stereotype of a Black woman. And it was almost always played for comedy. in other shows.
Right.
In Shuffle Along, it was going to be played sincerely. And they said, white audiences won't stand for it. They won't stand for it. And so it was really important, I think, to sort of ground the book in this moment. And the anecdote is I think, this really interesting blend of being kind of emphasizing the danger of this moment, but also kind of the humor in what was going on that you can look at from hindsight, because 3 of the 4 creators of the show are at the back entrance, literally with one foot out on the pavement, getting ready to hightail it out of the theater if things get bleak. And luckily, the audience erupts and they think, oh my, this is our time, we've got to go. And they realize that they're actually chanting for an encore. And so it was a nice moment, even though it could have been a scary moment.
Well, which other was it UB Blake that was stuck in the theater?
Yes.
Why the other 3 were going on?
Right. So UB Blake, who
was
was the composer, he's out there, conducting the orchestra,
right.
And the other 3 are getting ready to leave him, and he's hung out there to dry. So
that's funny. Why this story? And why did you want to do it? To tell this particular story of Shuffle Along.
This story of Shuffle Along, I think, is I always say it's a case study. It's not the case study, it's just an example. And certainly, as a historian and researcher yourself, that there are so many stories of people that that put their handprint in the wet cement of history, but over time their names sort of get forgotten. And Shuffle Along, to me, was one of these shining examples of that. It was, as I said, the first all-Black Broadway show to succeed. And when I say succeed, I just want to make it clear, I'm talking over 500 performances, 3 touring companies, offers to play overseas. They had major tours in every major city in the United States, and also the Deep South with an all-Black Broadway show. The Deep South. It was the show that actually was Josephine Baker's first professional gig. Paul Robeson was in the show for a moment. Nat King Cole was a part of one of the revival orchestras. It's the show that gave us the song, I'm Just Wild About Harry. So if you know that song, this show, even if you don't know this show.
You know the song.
You know the song.
Especially from the 48 election, yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, and helped bring Harry Truman back into the White House.
Yeah.
So, to me, it was amazing that there was a show that had so much importance that somehow was all but erased from history. And in fact, that's actually why I titled the book Footnotes, because as I was writing, I had this thought that we sort of feel, or at least not as a historian in the same sense that you are. So I will say myself as sort of a layperson, have this sort of sense that, everything that we're experiencing today is new, or it's fresh, it's original. But the reality is, there are lots of people that feel like someone like, let's say, Oprah, 100 years from now, Oprah will never be forgotten. She had such an amazing imprint. But the reality is, there was an Oprah of 100 years ago. Not in the same exact ways, but there were people that were just as significant 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And you know what? Their contributions have lasted, but their names might have been eroded over time. And so even if you're just remembered as a footnote, if your name is even remembered to that extent, it's sort of an accomplishment that you're even remembered that much. And I always feel like the footnotes of a book are often where the more interesting stories lie. And so I thought, what a great concept to sort of amplify all these people that have been pushed to the margins and amplify their stories.
Great. And why did you think it just became a footnote? I mean, like I said, I'm over the ESA Hack collection, I'm a historian. And as I said before, some of the sheet music from Shuffle Along, we do have original sheet music in the collection. We do have bios on Noble Sissel and UB Blake, as well as, say, Harlem Renaissance. But why did you think it just became a footnote? I mean, this was an extraordinary production. And it's something that I personally, only knew about it because of sheet music, but I didn't know about the historical significance, I would put it like that, of an all black cast, but that the creators were all black. Mm-hmm. And I believe in your book, you do go over that, saying early on, if there was something to be changed, well, they can just change it. It wasn't like someone else was telling them, hey, you can't do this or that. But it was really, I think, fascinating to have that as the other revivals went on. But creatively, at that time, 1921, it was amazing. So why did you think it became just a footnote?
I think there are lots of reasons, and the longer I sit with this story, the more reasons I come up with. So I won't give you an hour's worth of reasons. I'll keep it. But I think there are a couple of things. Number one, Shuffle Along was the only production where Noble Sissle, U.B. Blake, Flournoy Miller, and Aubrey Lyles, those four collaborated. And I think that that's actually part of it. Where when you think about choose any of your favorite performers from the Harlem Renaissance, there's a body of work there. A lot of people were solo artists, where this was really more of a collaborative effort. So I think there's that. But I also think a really interesting thing started to happen, where what made Shuffle Along so successful, and one of the things I didn't mention before, was that this was the first production that had a woman's dancing chorus. Not just women that came out and were ornamentation, but Black women were coming out on stage singing, tap dancing. They were performing. They were really giving everything. And what ended up happening was white producers would hire away the Black chorus dancers from Shuffle Along and ask them to be uncredited choreographers for some of the white shows. Compensate them very nicely.
Oh, but
ultimately, they're leaving this production. Right. They're going and contributing there. And ultimately what made Shuffle Along so special started to become not so special because it was appropriated by so many other shows.
Okay.
And I think the last reason that I'll sort of touch on, of my many in my head, is as the show was groundbreaking and incredibly progressive for its day, but there were some problematic aspects of it, certainly. Right. And so certainly by the 1950s, when there were still attempts to revive this show, and actually revivals of the show on Broadway, you had members of the Black community as well, in the same way that you would look at perhaps a Hattie McDaniel or a Stephen Fetchit or a Billy Thomas who played Buckwheat, saying, oh my goodness, no, we should bury that show. That show was actually regressive and not worth hoisting up as something to celebrate. It was a detriment. And I think that was something that really harmed the legacy of this show.
Oh, okay. For your, how long did the book take? And we're talking over 100 years now. So where did you get your resources, or the primary resources, to do this book? Because that's a lot. It's a large amount of work in here. And I'm like, most of the people are no longer here. So how do you pull this one off? Go ahead.
Yes. So I'm so glad to be here with the Detroit Public Library, because I love librarians, and I love libraries, and I love research librarians especially. Couldn't have done this without them, believe me. Believe me. So I spent a lot of time at the Schomburg Center in New York. UB Blake has archives it used to be called the Maryland Historical Society. Now I think they've renamed it, but that's essentially what it was, in the heart of Baltimore. At Emory, the Flournoy Miller has some archives. So I went around a little bit, and then COVID struck, and I had everything I thought I needed, but then of course when you never have everything. Right. And then I had some very kind librarians that I don't know what they did. They threw on 3 masks and broke into the library for me. they told me they couldn't, and I begged and pleaded, and I said, come on, please. They waived the elements for me. So but it took, after how long it took, I started working on this, I would say loosely in like early 2017, and then really earnestly in 2018. And then the book was out in 2021. It came out like 2 days before the exact centennial of Shuffle Along's debut on Broadway.
Did you happen to get the ideal or start to formulate it from the 2016 revival of Shuffle Along or whatever that production was on Broadway?
Yes. So I actually, so for those who don't know, there was a Shuffle Along was originally on Broadway in 1921. Then there was a revival in 1933. There was another revival in 1952.
Yeah, great.
And then there was a big drought. And George C. Wolfe, director, writer, wanted to tell this story of Shuffle Along. And in 2016 had a production that Billy Porter starred in, Audra McDonald, Brian Stokes Mitchell. So I actually saw this show, the 2016 show. Number one, I saw it on accident. And number two, I saw it the day before it closed, actually.
Day before it closed?
The day before it closed. Not on purpose. I wasn't trying to. It wasn't and so I was actually a part of a workshop, and included in the workshop were tickets to 4 Broadway shows. I didn't know what the shows were. They were Hamilton, Color Purple, Shuffle Along, and On Your Feet, the Gloria Estefan musical, which was complete trash. No offense to Gloria Estefan, it was a trash show. But so I saw Shuffle Along, and afterwards there was a talk back. And Brian Stokes Mitchell, who played Flournoy Miller, he said something that it gave me chills in the moment. He said, you know, he was so sad that this show was closing prematurely because the story of these artists had been buried time and again, and he felt like this 2016 production was just another burial of this story. There's no cast recording. There's video, there's no audio recording, there's no video except for what you can see at Lincoln Center, and that's only if you are a researcher. You know, that's not accessible to the general public. There's no published libretto or script. The licensing rights aren't available. So this show that happened in 2016, nominated for 10 Tony Awards and had the great misfortune of being up against Hamilton.
Yeah, that year,
just disappeared. I mean, when I tell people, I'm sure, you know, people that are tuned in right now, when you said the 2016 production, people said, what do you mean? What 2016?
2016, never even heard of it.
Recent, yeah. So I think that's really one of the interesting aspects of this. And that was sort of the catalyst for me as a writer to say, I have a responsibility to look into this more, to see, you know, what I can pull out. I think there's a different story you can tell in a book. And that was kind of the seed for me.
Okay. All right. With the production of Shuffle Along, and I know a lot of, like you said, the other productions like the 33 and the 52, trying to put in context with the blackface, because you had the blackface in there, as long with the you know, the jazz and the ragtime, which was brought to Broadway. But the depictions, and let's just say the playwrights, how did that context, like for the success of shows, because it was a big hit, but people expected, you know, Blacks to perform in that sort of way.
Yeah.
So, so if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Yes, sure. You just serve me up. No, sure. Yeah, and this is a good point to remind people. If you have questions, you can drop them in the chat, because usually people have lots of questions about this particular aspect. So yes, there were, as you said, you know, you had jazz, ragtime, you know, Cecil and Blake, the two musicians, never performed in blackface. They performed in tuxedos. You know, they were the prim and proper, and they were, you know, excellence, Black excellence on stage. Right. However, as you said, the playwrights were comedians. They were blackface comedians. They were Black actors in blackface. So I guess to directly answer your question, this really was something that so many people at the time wrote about this. Black thought leaders, W.E.B. Du Bois actually wrote favorably about Shuffle Along. That was amazing to read and to find. Claude McKay was a fan of Shuffle Along, and actually his issue with Shuffle Along wasn't so much the blackface, actually. It was more the brown paper bag test that was there for the women in the cast, and saying that, the colorism was his issue. But you had an interesting conversation within the Black community of people sort of, I'll say, understanding, quote unquote, or being tolerant of the fact that white audiences needed something that was going to be non-threatening to them in order to get them in the theater. And that if they were brought into the theater, Floyd Miller, who was one of the blackface comedians and the writer of the book, he said that blackface was the bait to draw some of the audience in.
Right.
And once they were in, they would appreciate the jazz, the ragtime, the humor, the amazing, it's not just the actors who were Black, the entire orchestra was Black. Everyone who worked on this show, save for just a hand, like 2 producers, and they were co-producers, they didn't own it, were Black. And so they felt like it was something that they were willing to do as a convention of the time. But you mentioned the revivals, actually, and one other point I'll make on that, which is, Frederick Douglass is quoted in the book. He's not referring to Shuffle Along. He's referring to, I think it's his quotes from the 1840s, but he says that, he decried the use of blackface, but he also felt like there was something to be gained anytime a white audience can see Black people perform their art. Okay. And so he was sort of torn about it. And I think that was a little bit of the sentiment at the time. And obviously we've seen how blackface has been incredibly weaponized. I mean, it's a deplorable practice, but we see the really negative ramifications of that, particularly when it's on white skin throughout history.
And one of the things that I really, really enjoyed about the book was that when you were talking about just the production, you weren't just talking about the production, you were talking about what was actually going on at that time and put it in a historical context. That was what I really loved about the book. This is 1921. We just had a global pandemic. You just had a war going on. You had the rise of the Klan. You had the riots in Tulsa, 1921. So this was a very, very turbulent time. And then to come out with this type of production and become this hit is kind of amazing. And I always like the backstories of a lot of the creative people, like Noble Sissel, who was with Jim Europe, and how when a lot of these people served in World War I, and then thought when they came back, they were going to get treated differently. They served their country. They went over there. I know they were fighting like the Harlem Hellfighters. They fought, they died, and they thought they were going to come back to this, and they didn't. So if you want to go over that historic context, especially during 1921, like I said, it's amazing to have that production become a hit with all of the violence, and you do cover some of the lynching and everything that's going on throughout the country at this time.
Yeah, it's astonishing. And if I can, zoom out for just a moment from that question and say it was stunning, because I did so much research for this book over the course of really 2018 to 2020. And based on when my deadline was for my editor, the time that I really needed to start really focusing and really writing full time was March of 2020. And of course, March of 2020 is when, it ended up being great for my schedule, but it ended up being horrible. And so there were moments, and I mean this quite seriously, there were moments where I was going out to a rally, a protest, a march, and I was out for 4 hours, and then I was coming back to write about a period in the aftermath of a global pandemic, people that were protesting about lynchings, people that like it was actually so surreal almost to write portions of this book in the backdrop of, or against the backdrop rather, of what was going on in the summer of 2020 in America. This period, the summer of 1919, which you alluded to, was the greatest period of racialized violence in this country since the Civil War. Because, not in spite of, but because when Black soldiers came back from World War II, there were a lot of people throughout the United States that felt like these Black folks, certainly not called Black folks at the time, were getting too big for their britches. They were above their raising. There were, you can go and look at newspaper archives and see sometimes lynchings would start or would occur simply because a Black person entered a shop wearing an army uniform.
Right.
That was enough to set people off. And in fact, you mentioned Tulsa.
Yeah.
The Tulsa Race Massacre was 1 week after Shuffle Along's opening. And when you look at some of the newspaper articles from that time, there's someone that I quoted in the book. He was a local reverend. And he said, this erupted, I'm paraphrasing, he said this erupted overnight, but in reality, this had been simmering for some time, because while yes, the Black people had their section, we had our section, when they came back from the war, they didn't always sit in their section of the train. They didn't always, when they would walk down the street, they wouldn't always step to the side when a white person was, these people came back with a different sense of self. And so the anti-Black sentiment had actually been brewing in Tulsa, and the kindling had been set. And then there was this sort of precipitating incident that ignited everything. So it is actually astonishing that Shuffle Along did succeed against this backdrop. The other thing that I should probably mention that actually I think helped it to succeed was Prohibition, in a strange sort of sense, because it gave white people in particular, but not just white people, it gave people they had to find these interesting places to hang out. People would go see Shuffle Along and then they'd go slumming it up in Harlem.
Yeah.
And the musicians would go and play a speakeasy or play an apartment rent party. And so it was really kind of an interesting moment that can't be replicated. I mean, New York in 1921, that's a very special period, as you know. I know that's your area of expertise.
Yeah. Okay. So I think Langston Hughes said Shuffle Along was the beginning, or let's just say, I would say almost the foundation, whatever, the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. Can you talk a little bit about that? How this just particular production started things rolling. I won't say roaring 20s, but let's face it, it was a very interesting time. But how did this production start off with which would continue to be the Harlem Renaissance, which is still felt today from that period?
Yeah. So using Langston Hughes as an example, Langston Hughes, his father wanted him to study abroad for school, and Langston Hughes actually went to Columbia University, not Columbia the country, Columbia University, because he wanted to go to New York, because he wanted to see Florence Mills in Shuffle Along. That is it single-handedly. That's from his 1940 or 1941 memoir, The Big C. Right. He says that is the thing that brought him to New York, and not only brought him to New York, but his father didn't want him to go so badly that his father stopped paying his rent, stopped paying his tuition. Like, he actually emancipated himself from his father to see Shuffle Along.
She shuffle along.
So, when you think about all of the Black artists that descended onto New York just because they wanted to audition for this show, think about all of the Black artists. When there are 3 separate touring companies, that's all of the employment, not just for the actors, but also for the orchestras. Those are hundreds of people employed going out throughout the country. And also, Shuffle Along, as I mentioned, really helped make Harlem a place where whites wanted to go. It was trendy, it was cool, it was the flavor of the month, to the point where there were some really interesting articles and essays that I found of Black people by the mid 1920s saying, it used to be that like the 1 or 2 white people in the club or the speakeasy would be the odd person out. Now, as a Black person, I'm the odd person out when I go in Harlem. So you really can't actually, and the other thing I should mention too is that there were so many copycat productions of Shuffle Along, and I don't even want copycat is maybe too negative of a term, but there were so many imitators, competitors. There were, by 1924, there were 9 all-Black productions on Broadway, and most of them had casts of over 100. I mean, think about that. There were more Black artists working on Broadway in 1924 than there are today. Today. I mean, I think it's a big claim to say Shuffle Along kickstarted the Harlem Renaissance, but you and I didn't say it, Langston Hughes did. And so I
go with Langston on that one.
Yeah, I agree.
I go with Langston on that one.
Yeah.
For when you were talking about the other productions, were they based closely on Shuffle Along, or did they have some variants? Were there some of the performers that were in original Shuffle Along 21 end up being in the cast of these other 9? And one other question, the other 9, did they actually have tour? Did they tour? Or is it just basically for Broadway?
Great question. Yeah, great. So they did tour a little bit. It's a funny thing that ended up happening. I didn't know this until I started researching, but shows did go on tour. All Black shows did go on tour, and then they would go out as far as they had money for, and if they started to lose a profit and they had to fold the show, that was it. They just, wherever, if it was St. Louis, if it was Detroit, if it was Los Angeles, wherever they stopped, the creators, the producers went back home to New York, and everyone else was just stranded.
Just stranded.
That's it. So there's some interesting stories, certainly not funny for them at the time, but kind of stories in the book about that. But it's an interesting thing because, as I mentioned, Shuffle Along was the only production that Cecil and Blake, who were a creative partnership, and Miller and Lyles, who were a creative partnership, they collaborated on that one show together. But they had creative differences. They busted up a little bit. And so Cecil and Blake created a show called Chocolate Dandies, which Josephine Baker went with them to go be in that show.
Right.
And Miller and Lyles created a show called Runnin' Wild, which is actually the show that gives us the Charleston. Yeah. So that number comes out of that show. So yeah, they did have tentacles for sure.
Okay. Speaking of that, the Chocolate Dandies, or now I did have now is it in Banville, or how did that work? I mean, was in Banville the first one, and then Chocolate Dandies, or how did that work? And why didn't some of their successive or their the other productions that they put on as popular as Shuffle Along? Because they did try other things, or becoming more, I can say, more professional or whatever. Some called it too white. But for that group, how come they wasn't as successful with their other productions besides Shuffle?
Yeah, so So when they started Cecil and Blake's show, they started it with the title In Bamville, because that was
Right.
it was set in this fictional town called Bamville. And then ultimately they changed it right at the last minute before it came to Broadway to the Chocolate Dandies. So that was a show that was really polished. It actually was something that drove Noble Cecil crazy. They would go to these beautiful theaters, these old vaudeville palaces,
Right.
and they would go with this show that was a little bit, you could see the tatters and the sweat stains, in the costumes. So they really said, great, we have money now, we're a hit, we're gonna put on all the shine. And there were critics, particularly white critics, of course, who said, well, why would anyone go pay top dollar to see Black people do a quote unquote white show? We'll go pay to see them do a Black show, but to do a white show, we'll pay white people to do a white show.
White show.
Conversely, Runnin' Wild had almost the exact opposite criticism, which was that there was so much comedy, and keep in mind they were Blackface comedians, that people felt like it was actually not, there wasn't enough shine to it, actually. And so it's funny because Shuffle Along, when we talk about it being lightning in a bottle, it was almost like there was a chemist who said, like, just enough of this, just enough of that, the social conditions, the economic conditions, all, it all came together to make this perfect combination of things. And then the other shows, they were all just a little bit off. And the other thing I should probably mention too is, by the time Chocolate Dandies and Runnin' Wild were out, there were already more Shuffle Alongs. There were other artists that were doing similar things, sometimes with white producers backing them, that were able to hire more people or get better costumes or have more spectacle. And so the waters were very muddied by that period.
All right. The revivals of 33 and 52, why did they kind of flop? I know you had talked about it briefly, but why did those kind of like, at this time, different cast members, I know different casts, different choruses, but why did they kind of like go?
Yeah, so the 33 production, there was a lot of, between the four people, the best way that I can sort of describe it is it was like a almost like a Fleetwood Mac reunion, where like you knew that they kind of hated each other, but they were going to get back together and try it anyway. So the band got put back together, and then Aubrey Lyles, actually, he died while the show was like a couple months before the show was going to open.
He died in 32.
So it was really a blow to that production. And they changed the book, they changed the music a little bit, they kept some things that worked, but it was a revival, but not in the true sense of it. It didn't work. I don't remember exactly how many performances it lasted, but it was a very short run. I do remember how many performances the 52 but it was a short run, and they went on tour. And the kind of fun fact about the 33 production, the best thing about the 33 production is that Nat King Cole was a part of the orchestra for that show. And so when they went on tour, they busted up in California, and they didn't have money. He didn't have money, Nat King Cole, to get back to New York. So he set shop up in California, and that's when he started gigging around and actually got the nickname of King. So if it weren't for that production of Shuffle Along 33, maybe we wouldn't have Nat.
They would have Nat King Cole. All right.
And then the 52 production was incredibly ill-fated in every way, shape, and form. Pearl Bailey. Oh, you know what? It's such a shame. I have it. Oh, wait, I have it here. Wait a second. This was in my office. Give me one moment. Hold on. I wasn't even planning to show this, but someone, believe it or not, when you write a book, sometimes people who've read your book say, I have something in my attic, I've never looked at it in years.
Okay.
Would you like this? So someone reached out to me, and they had this is the program of the Shuffle
man.
Along of 1952 that was printed. And you'll notice that this is Pearl Bailey here.
Right.
But Pearl Bailey never was in that production. This was printed before she dropped from the production. So, which is actually astonishing. I've never shown someone literally. I just got this in the mail a couple of weeks ago. And there are all these great quotes from Pearl Bailey praising this show that she dropped out of.
That she dropped out of.
Publicists were hard at work back in 1952. But the show was. I won't give all the twists and turns because the story of the 1952 production is really astonishing. But let's just say there was a lot of monkeying around with not only the book, but also the score. Okay. And they brought in these white songwriters to basically throw out everything from the original Shuffle Along and rewrite all of the music.
Oh, man. And
they were kind of ghostwriters. Sissel and Blake were still co-credited, but they had nothing of theirs remained in the show. And to the point where actually UB Blake was fired after when they were in their pre-Broadway tryout, he was actually fired from playing in the orchestra. And so that Broadway run lasted 4 performances on Broadway.
And that was it.
And that was it.
All right. Couple of more questions. Out of the 4, Miller, Lyles, Sissel, and Blake, of the stories, I'm not going to go who you like best, but which
I was going to say, don't do it. Don't do it to me.
I'm not going to do that one to you. But which one you can closely identify with? Not like, but which one of the 4 you are closely identified with or can identify with their story?
I'm going to be honest with you. I've never been asked that question in that way before. It's a great question. I think I want to say Flournoy Miller in a sense, and I'll say why. I think UB has a more dynamic story. Okay, it's not the story that I can relate to most. Miller really. So first of all, Miller is really he's an understated person a little bit, but he's really the person who had the idea to invite Sissel and Blake to join them on this venture. He was really the one who did all of the writing of the book. Aubrey Lyles was his creative partner, and he was happy to share credit. And I think what I like most about Miller is, number one, he had this amazing dream that he had put some plans into motion of owning the first all-Black Broadway house. He didn't just want to do silly comedies. He actually wrote dramas. He wrote these really interesting plays that grappled with race in the 1920s, and he wanted to establish a legitimate theater. And actually he wanted to pivot away from blackface and musical comedy. And both he and Aubrey Lyles had a bunch of investors, and they spent all their money in this. And right as they were getting it off the ground, that coincided with when Aubrey Lyles died. And that dream, there still is no Black-owned Broadway house. There never has been. Oh man! So it's amazing to think about the fact that there was actually money in place, and there was, these plans were being made. And after Aubrey Lyles died, not only did this theater not happen, but Miller had to file for bankruptcy. He was actually a little bit destitute as a result. And I guess the last thing that I'll say that I really related to with him was, of the 4 of them, he was always the one who was always writing material for them, even until the 70s, just in case they ever wanted to get back together. Oh man! And actually, it's funny. There's a story that Stan Laurel did the same. Even after Oliver Hardy had died, Stan Laurel kept writing Laurel and Hardy bits just because it was just in his DNA. It's just the way he worked. And so I think Miller has a really interesting sort of story, and and UB gets enough credit. So
I like UB. Sorry, I like UB. What do you think the overall legacy of Shuffle Along is? And I can say that just generally, and to you after doing all this research. I mean, what did you come away with it?
What I came away with is there was such, I have such an appreciation for the heroism of all of these artists. And I'm going to say, especially the women artists who were a part of this cast, because the women, by and large, many of them came to New York because they were either leaving abusive relationships, whether it was their fathers, their husbands. Some of them were married incredibly too young. Some, they came to New York in the kind of cliche with nothing but a small bag with a handful of clothes. And they were, when Josephine Baker came to New York, she was sleeping on park benches for weeks until she, kind of got her footing a little bit. And there's something about knowing what you're meant to do and having that conviction. And even though it's tough and maybe or you feel that's your only way out, but
right,
you're gonna take that way. You're gonna try and take that way. I think that's a story of Black people in America, frankly. The sort of cliche about, making a way out of no way. That's the story of Shuffle Along, by and large. Yeah. And for me, I think part of the legacy of this show, or part of what I wanted to do with amplifying this story, is I work with theater students and I work with young performers. And
right.
I've been in the room when people have come in and either they sing something from Gershwin or so, I'm talking about Black performers,
right?
Because that's the Great American Songbook. Or they come in and they're singing Home from The Wiz, or they're singing, Old Man River, or they're singing something like that. And I feel like there's something so important about just expanding or just opening the lens of what is the Great American Songbook. Harry is, this is a part of the Great American Songbook.
Yes.
It's not just, Gershwin. And so I think letting people know that for all the great diversity that's on Broadway now, which is important and impressive, we were there a long time ago, succeeding. And people were imitating us. We weren't trying to catch up to what other people are doing. People were catching up to what we were doing.
Right.
And I think it's just important to set the record straight on that.
Okay. Yeah, because that's, for me, it was, like I said, coming from the history side and the preservation side of this material. It was that a lot of stuff is lost and lost from memory unless it is preserved, whether somebody's putting all the research together like you did, or me on the other end having the sheet music and the bios and for people to research, because a lot does get discarded, people, in history. And being a historian myself and actually being a curator and preservationist, that's why I enjoy the most, because people are like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that happened. Oh, I thought this only happened here, and I thought it was only these people or that people. And you have the original primary source material for the stuff that's being kept. And it's great that, like I said, people as yourself are out there putting this stuff together for future generations to look at and go, oh, I had no idea. Because they don't have that connection to the past. A lot of people don't have a connection to the past. Even, performers in the field, like, they don't have this knowledge. And so somebody like you bringing that knowledge is great. So, like I said, I really enjoyed the book. So
I wanted to add one more thing when I
go right ahead.
Talk about, well, actually two quick things. First of all, I wanted to share for everyone whether you're checking out the book at the library or, we have great partners at Source Booksellers who have copies of the book as well. We have a reading guide for the book, which has a lot of extra material. So if you have immersed yourself in this world and you kind of want to be steered in a certain direction, we have little snippets of newspaper articles. We have little snippets of more backstory and sort of places to find. So what I can do is certainly, maybe I'm trying to think of a good way to do it, but maybe I can send a copy of there's an accessible link to it. And maybe I can send it to the Detroit librarian and maybe everyone who registered. I'm improvising here.
That's fine. Yeah.
We send a copy.
Yeah.
But that's one. The other thing too, though, is I can't say too much about it. I'm not allowed to, but I'm very happy to say that Footnotes, the book has actually been optioned for a potential miniseries. And so what I'm really hoping is that this story has the ability to not only live on in book form, but also to be able to bring this story to people on television, I think would be great. And I just, because it's a story that is so rich, and I was so thankful that I'm thankful that my editor allowed me to go significantly over word count. Significantly over word count. I didn't set off to write a book of this size, but it is what it is.
I know.
But
well, even because they kept trying to, do Shuffle Along as a movie. I think you were, and they never got around to, to doing it. They want to do this, a movie version of it.
I'm hoping that we can, this would really be a story of these artists and what, and all of that backstory we've been talking about. But also, it's really important. The team that's working on this is so determined to have pieces of the show for an extended period of time, show pieces of the show so that people can see what this really felt like and looked like. And so, I'm hoping that the
we don't have. We have all the publicity stills. I see those, but we don't have that actual, performance. So
in motion.
Yeah. True. Okay, so I guess we will open up the questions. Christine wants to look at the questions, so we can do that.
Questions, they can drop them now if they haven't dropped before.
Let me see. Okay, so Christine back. Hi, Christine.
I'm back. Well, Caseen already talked about one of the questions, the readers group guide. And what we can do is when we post this video, we can, if you send us that link, we can put that in the notes of the video when we post it.
All right, great.
Let's see, I'm not seeing anybody with any questions. Everybody's learned everything they could learn.
Oh, that's funny.
We did such a comprehensive job.
we covered everything. Thank you so much for being, okay, all right.
Oh, is there any significance I guess, for Detroit in this book?
Well, actually, Shuffle Along, I believe that it did pass through, it played every major city, so it did pass through Detroit. And, I think, frankly, I am so happy to, as Romy mentioned before, that there are actual pieces of Shuffle Along history in Detroit in terms of original sheet music that you can go, there's some available, it's digital, so you don't have to just go. I've learned something about libraries over this experience, that you never touch these materials with your bare hands. You don't do that, and I'm very respectful of those things, but digital materials are great to be able to engage with. So Detroit has such a rich theatrical history, and I'm so happy to be invited to be here and share this with Detroit, and also whomever, wherever you are in the world right now.
I have a question for you, and maybe I missed it because I have to keep running back and forth. Do you have more books in your future?
Oh, I certainly hope so. I mean, I do. You know, I'm always working on something in the background, and you know, working on Footnotes has really inspired. I shouldn't say inspired me, but really, I feel such a calling to trying to seek out untold or lost stories of notable Black figures, and so it's, you know, some things are in the work, you know, Caseen, but, but yeah, no, I hope that there's more, because it's important. It's important to, as Romy was saying before, to preserve this history, and that's why I tell everyone, you know, I want people to, whether it's going to Source booksellers or checking it out from the library, you know, buy a copy from Source and give it, you know, pass it on to 3 friends afterwards. But I really think this is a book that, for me, if I were reading it, I would want a friend to have it as well, because I would want to talk about it with someone afterwards. You know, I don't want to just read it and keep it to myself. So yeah, there's more stories for sure.
Okay, cool. Okay, so we've had a great conversation tonight, gentlemen.
Okay.
So any final words from anyone before we go?
I think for me, it was a pleasure actually talking about reading the book and talking to the author, because I rarely get a chance to do that on occasion. And fascinating book because it covers the period I love, which is 1920s. And because I've been curator for the Hackley since 2006. So this was right in my wheelhouse. So this was really enjoyable read for me. And then actually have a discussion with the author, I think was just fascinating. So that was one of my last comments. So I really enjoyed it.
Well, and I appreciate that so much. And for me, you know, it's you know, we happen to be in Black History Month right now, but I think it's really important that we tell these stories and amplify these stories, you know, year round. So I'm hopeful that, you know, everyone who's tuning in, take this, you know, enjoy it, digest it. If you're an audiobook lover and the sound of my voice hasn't annoyed you for the last hour, I read the audiobook, so you can have me, you know, you can take me with you in the car and I can do it that way. But seriously, I think it's, we are such, we come from such amazing stock, you know, and I felt honored to be able to pay homage to my ancestors, our ancestors in this way, and to try and keep their story alive for people. And so I'm so pleased that you enjoyed it, and I hope that everyone who checks out Footnotes, literally at the library, checks it out, has an enjoyable experience and remembers that these are real people that did amazing things.
Well, Caseen, I hope that when we can travel again, you'll keep us in mind, because we would love to see you live and in person, and you could take a look at our collection here.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Romy would love to meet you in person. I would love to meet you in person.
It would be an absolute pleasure. Absolutely.
All right.
And so keep us in mind, especially if your other project comes to Forte. Maybe we can pre-screen some of it.
Oh, nice.
Here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because we've done that before, so we can do that. So
Nice.
we would love to do something like that for you.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for the invitation. Thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you, Romy, for a great conversation.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to actually discuss your book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and everyone have a good night.
All right.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.